Welcome to today's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, I will turn it over to ASP Senior Fellow for Climate Security, Jessica Yamo.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are from. Thank you for joining us today. ASP is pleased to host today's event, Earth, Fire, Wind, Water, Climate Considerations in Nevada. I am Jessica Alcott-Ulimo. I'm the Senior Fellow for Climate Security here at ASP, and I am pleased to welcome our panel, Mr. Christopher Sanchez, Deputy Director of the Nevada Governor's Office of Economic Development, Ms. Kirsten Stasio, Executive Director of Nevada's Clean Energy Fund, Colonel Dave Belote, United States Air Force retired, and ASP consensus member, and Dr. Tamara Wall, Deputy Director of the Western Regional Climate Center, as well as Representative Dina Titus. Thanks, everybody. We have a lot to cover here today. Obviously, the title is a play on words a bit with Captain America. Nevada is a really interesting place with a lot of really interesting, innovative approaches to climate. So perhaps we can just start by pitching it to Chris. And Chris, maybe you can talk about some of the executive orders and the laws that have been passed and how Nevada is really implementing a whole of government approach to addressing the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd like to thank ASP for bringing together this panel at this time and having this very important dialogue. You know, as I think about this panel and coming into my remarks, one of the things that I thought I'd focus on was this idea of breaking down barriers. You know, climate change, as we all know, is an issue that's not going to be solved by one jurisdiction or one state. And we have to take a full ecosystem networked approach to solving these issues. And one of the things that was done very early on as the climate strategy was developed for Nevada was the idea that we would start to coordinate across government jurisdictions within our agencies here. And now as we look at economic development more broadly, we're looking at cross-state partnerships. And how that really gets down to the practical level is the policies that are adopted in, let's say, California, for instance. What are the impacts going to be for us as we seek to have resiliency here in Nevada, both in the context of climate change, but also, long-term viability of our communities. And so it's interesting to me if you think about ecology and the terminology that's used there, and we're starting to see those terminologies pop up in economic development. So ecosystems, resiliency, which I've probably already said twice or more in the first minute here. But the idea of a whole state approach, and one thing that's I find intriguing anyway, is that Nevada has kind of lagged in this area. So Governor O'Callaghan back in 1973 actually had created an Office of Planning. And the idea there was that we would coordinate along grand strategic objectives that the state had. That Office of Planning over time, for various reasons, kind of fell away. And California in 1978 created the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And there was a trend going in that time across the US for states to be internally more coordinated around these big policy objectives. And so California now has had, 30, 40 years of practice, if you will, in coordinating across state jurisdiction to mitigate the impacts of climate change, to address them and the complexities that all that brings. Whereas in Nevada, we are just starting to do that. We lost some ground because we had institutionalized beyond the executive order that was done in 1973 to a system that was in statute, as California, as Utah, as Georgia, the list goes on and on, we would be able to I think, better address some of these issues. So now that this whole government approach kind of seeks to get at that objective, which is we need to coordinate our land use planning. We need to coordinate, our emission standards. We need to coordinate, DOT and economic development and, the alphabet soup of agencies in the state around achieving these objectives. And one last point I'll make, and then for the panel and keep my remarks short here, is that we're working with Utah, we're working with California, we're doing so post-pandemic around supply chains, around freight movement. We're looking at better utilization of rail. And the idea is that when we start to address these issues and what types of infrastructure to build, how we approach like Union Pacific, BNSF, and other shippers and the legacy carriers, we do so from an aggregated approach that serves industry, that addresses our sustainability challenges and climate change, and ultimately provides a better livable environment for our citizens. So, thanks.
Excellent. And Kirsten, maybe we can pivot over to you on that. You're sort of the operational arm of some of these policies at the Clean Energy Fund. Can you talk at all about how you're approaching the state holistically, but also at the same time while you're weighing the different requirements from the north to the south?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so what this whole of government approach that Christopher talked about really means in practice is a wide range of efforts from the state, from developing an adaptation plan for helping folks deal with extreme heat. Last weekend, Las Vegas was dealing with 111-degree weather, so it's very salient right now for the state. And I think in previous events that the ASP has talked about, it's highlighted the fact that the Las Vegas area and the Reno areas are some of the fastest warming cities in the US. So that adaptation effort is really important and a big component. But also, the state's been very aggressive on zero emission vehicles. And then, another measure that the state has taken is really launching the Nevada Clean Energy Fund, which is the nonprofit organization that I'm the executive director of. And it's the state's green bank that's really meant to apply investment and lending tools and market-based mechanisms to tackle climate change and leverage the private sector. So in that regard, the state government is really bringing all the different tools and resources to bear in tackling this issue, not just policies and standards and grants, but also these kind of market-based mechanisms to make progress. And I think all these efforts are really dovetailing really well with the federal bipartisan infrastructure law, which is a great opportunity to bring those much needed resources into this state, both grant and lending resources. And I also just want to take a minute to call out the efforts by Dr. Kristen Averett, who's the senior climate advisor to the governor, who she couldn't be here today, but she's really taking a leading role in a lot of these climate efforts within the state government.
That's fantastic. Yeah, and you mentioned heat, which is obviously very present right now. There's a huge heat wave in Europe, and there's actually been some discussion about naming heat waves, much in the similar way that we do with hurricanes. Has there been any conversation about that? Or maybe Dr. Wall, you could talk about your work at the Climate Research Center and the Desert Research Institute about evolutions that you're seeing across, how we're approaching climate in general.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the biggest changes that we've seen in how research is beginning to integrate with decision making and planning was actually started about 25 years ago in NOAA with the Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program, and that was kind of a nascent program that currently is built out to 11 teams across the nation. California and Nevada are part of the California and Nevada adaptation program. I'm fortunate to be a co-PI on that with Julie Kalansky from Scripps Institution Oceanography in California. And that has also supported us over this time frame to really think about doing what we call research for decision support. And we work more on the adaptation side than the mitigation side, but the focus there is really in science translation. So translating science, research, and outputs for decision makers and planners and local communities, so we can support their decision making and planning process. And then capacity building for using climate information. So actually doing train the trainers programs, doing infographics, and again, focusing on that science translation. And that is a really big change from basic science and applied science, which are both very, very important. But what we do at DRI in the Western Regional Climate Center is our group really focuses on, that type of capacity building research and research for decision makers. And so I think that's been a big change, and we're starting to see more networks that are focusing on that. For example, the USGS funded Climate Adaptation Science Centers is another network, as well as Sea Grant that does that work.
That's fantastic. So along those same lines and along the renewable energy, can we talk a little bit, and this is sort of an open question for anybody who wants to take it, can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the renewable industry in in Nevada. I mean, the Nevada website, the climate website states that it's the #1 state in the nation with the most solar potential. So can you talk about that? Dave, maybe this is a question for you and your experience at Nellis or in the industry at large. Can you talk at all about that evolution and some of the considerations, the climate considerations that are going in to those resourcing and programs? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I thought I unmuted. Now I'm good. And let's see, do I have, can you allow me to share a screen?
I don't know.
No harm, no foul if you can't.
Okay.
I'm always, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But Nevada was way ahead of everybody, and Nellis Air Force Base from 2007 to 2011 had the largest photovoltaic array on the continent. And if you see a picture of Harry Reid and Barack Obama with an Air Force dude in a tree suit standing in between the two of them, that's me. And let's see, I might be able to share that photo. So this was the beginning of solar energy for the United States Air Force, for the country in many ways. And I am, because of this photo, erroneously given some kind of credit for this. No, it all goes to a woman named Michelle Price, who was the base energy manager. Base energy managers are quite a few steps below the man or woman on the very top. She had a great idea, and my predecessor did what good commanders do, got out of her way, gave her some resources, and built a 14 megawatt solar array in an era when a 500 kilowatt array was huge. So Nevada has been in the forefront for quite some time, but that is going to show the challenges that everybody has. It was very exciting to hear Chris talking about, this whole of government approach way back then. And immediately after I left Nellis and went to the Pentagon to create a renewable energy siting office in the office of the SecDef. That thought just went and left. I should watch out for my dachshunds. Whole of government. We got into the California Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, and there is a big tie between Nellis and the state BLM office, and working through both of those, reaching over just west across the border into the area around Navy China Lake. DOD and all of the Department of Defense entities in Nevada had a big role in figuring out how can we site compatibly. And that is going to remain the huge issue for all of y'all in Nevada. The Air Force, DOD writ large, really understands that climate security is national security, that climate instability creates issues all around the world that we're going to have to respond to. But the unique thing with, I think, 84% of Nevada being federal land and 2.9 million acres of that being the Nevada Test and Training Range, there are some really, really sensitive programs out there that spinning turbines are going to have some significant issues with. So I represent a number of wind companies. We are trying to find places on the outskirts of the Nevada Test and Training Range where you'll be able to put wind. Solar PV is in most cases always compatible. Well, in most cases compatible with military flight operations. But everybody, I hope, has seen Top Gun. Between Top Gun up around Fallon, between what happens in Southern Nevada, through Nellis and Creech, you've got a tightrope to walk to find that exact balance between preserving some space for these very important programs, but pushing renewable energy, carbon-free energy to solve the ultimate problem for the country and the planet.
That's great. Chris, did you have something that you wanted to add to that?
Thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that maybe to kind of pull back or a higher level for a second here is that, we're very much mindful as an economic development organization of kind of emerging trends in industry. And where we ought to be focusing our efforts as we look to the future and kind of this shift that we're seeing occur for a lot of reasons. Post pandemic, there's one thing I'll mention I think is a good example of how this works, and I think it can speak to a number of different verticals under this sustainability umbrella and climate change. But our Southern Nevada Water Authority, for instance, is one of the top municipal providers in the world for their reuse and recycling. And we've looked at that as an asset, and how do we grow that capability? How do we export that knowledge base? And how do we use it to inform decisions regionally? And so you'll hear throughout this hour or so of at least my remarks on this idea of being regional in the macro region in the Southwest. We've got to make decisions now as partners. In fact, I was just on a call prior to this call with representatives from different mining associations in the states. And we're talking about, how do we kind of come together to solve some of these larger problems? How do we get to better efficiencies? How do we mitigate, our carbon emissions, for instance, by utilizing more rail? And what type of infrastructure needs to be built to support that? What should be built in Utah? What should be built in Wyoming? What should be built in Nevada? Let's build the things that should be built in those localities there and break down the barriers that are predicated on competition. And so when you look at, we have a committee right now that we're looking at, the legislature is set up in Nevada to look at a regional transmission model. And so we're looking at regional transmission across the country and examples that exist and how we might get to better efficiencies and better utilization of our grid here in the Southwest by a regional approach. We're doing the same thing with supply chains and infrastructure related to like inland port facilities and looking at that. We're doing the same thing with the mining association, as I mentioned, not to be repetitive, but this goes at what is a strategy here and a much more focused effort recently to look at kind of the role Nevada plays in the Southwest region and nationally, and where as an economic development entity, we ought to be focusing to make sure that the state is not only resilient, but frankly, over time, relevant in these conversations. And what we're seeing is if we don't take action, if we don't start to drive this dialogue amongst our state partners, we are going to fall behind. We already have land deficits across our state. We have a lack of infrastructure in critical areas where we need it most. We have, everybody knows about the water issue. You can't open up a newspaper across the country and not see Lake Mead and pictures of it. But we've got to really be aggressive in leading, because if we are not leading in these areas, we are going to suffer, I think, significantly from an economic development standpoint. So energy, I got, kind of a broader perspective there, but energy is one of those where we've had a lot of opportunity. We see the private industry coming in and investing. A lot of that is making sure that we have the proper guardrails in place, but we also continue to be a state where those type of investments are welcome, that we work with private industry in a regional context, especially through the regional transmission context, and making sure that we have an efficient grid, that power can be distributed where it's needed most, that we have the ability to store power with some of the new technologies coming online there, and that we listen to industry and we listen to those opportunities that industry is communicating and investing in. And so I think the biggest challenge for economic development right now for us is that when you look at lithium, when you look at energy transmission, there's all these new technologies, and you can't predicate economic development strategies on new technology, but we want to be able to lay the foundation in such a way that Nevada remains competitive over time.
Thanks, Chris. Representative Titus, would you like to chime in?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the format is. Do I now give a little presentation, or
Sure.
are y'all asking questions that we were all respond to as panelists, or what?
I'm doing a Q&A right now, but you're welcome to give any remarks that you would like to.
Well, you go ahead and finish. I don't want to interrupt what you're doing, and then maybe I'll give some remarks. But I want to say hello to Colonel Belote. I hadn't seen him in a long time. It's nice to see his face.
Congresswoman, likewise, and you gave me one of the biggest honors of my career. The Congresswoman first took office when I was in command out at Nellis, and I gave her and her staff a couple of tours and a little bit of Nellis 101. She responded by very graciously making me her guest at the State of the Union address in 2010. So if you had looked at Barack Obama, and if he'd have put his arm up like this and pointed as far away as you could be and still be in the House chamber, there I was with my back against the wall. But just like they said in Hamilton, I was in the room where it happened. And I thank you very much for that honor, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's get back sort of to it. Thanks, Dave, for that. Dr. Wall, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the research that the DRI is doing to inform some of these climate initiatives in Nevada and in the region writ large.
Sure. So, we have a lot of, so DRI is what we call a soft money research institute. So we're supported by funders. And so we have a lot of federal agencies that we work with, and those are great partnerships. There's NIDIS, the National Integrated Drought Information System, which is based in NOAA. I've already mentioned RISA, the Regional Integrated Science and Assessments, which is also in NOAA, the Regional Climate Centers, and then also the CAS, the USGS sponsored Climate Adaptation Science Centers. And so the role that we often play is it can be really difficult, for these federally based, programs to really understand what the needs are at local and sub-regional levels. So we often play a role in facilitating, just trying to understand what our local partner needs are. So both within Nevada and, and also sometimes at a sub-regional level with California and Nevada combined, or the larger Southwest at that regional level. Just to give a quick example, some of our upcoming projects for CNAP is we're providing some seed money to develop the Southern Nevada Heat Resilience Lab. And we're hoping that that will be a convening organization as well as a science translation set of projects that will really focus on understanding local needs and understanding where the gaps are in research. And also where there's opportunities to build capacity to use climate information, improve messaging about extreme heat, for example. We're also looking at wildfire smoke impacts in Northern Nevada and Northern California, which, as Kirsten can attest, our wildfire smoke impacts have been really, really bad in Northern Nevada the past couple of years. We have an ongoing project right now that's funded through the EPA, where we've actually are trying to prototype relatively low cost platforms that we can do air quality observations. And a lot of times the problem with the most common sensors is they require Wi-Fi and a plug. And oftentimes we just, in rural areas in particular in Nevada, we really need to have capacity to monitor air quality where we don't have either one of those things. And so we're prototyping some new sensors and platforms, and then working with our local emergency managers to get that information out, and then also developing a set of infographics and messaging materials that emergency managers can use, for example, to do outreach with their communities. We'll also be looking at some health impacts of wildfire in an upcoming project, which should launch next year in both Washoe County and Northern California.
That's super interesting. Have you seen, or I guess, what are the differences that you've seen in the demand signals for the kind of information, the types of information, and how much you have to produce? Are you getting a lot more requests for information, and what are the changes that you've seen over the past several years?
I would say there's a lot more demand at the state level. We called it a Nevada Climate Assessment Light for Nevada's climate initiative that came out in 2020. We didn't have a lot of resources for that, so we just kind of aggregated up existing data and did our best. But recently, we put in a request for some congressional funding to do a full Nevada climate assessment, which would be somewhat similar to what California has been doing for, decades now. As Christopher noted, California is about on its fifth climate assessment is spinning up right now. And several of us at DRI have actually supported that through the California-Nevada adaptation program. So we have some experience that we can bring to Nevada to work on that. So I would say it's really amplified at the state level. It's also starting to really amplify in our rural communities as well. particularly around wildfire smoke impacts. Like those are so detrimental with physical health, with daily life, and also mentally, that, addressing, that smoke is not going to go away. We're going to continue to have these episodes. So trying to develop adaptation strategies so that we can keep people healthy through them, and deal with the mental health impacts, and change how our daily lives are structured, for those parts of the year is going to be increasingly important.
That's very interesting. Kirsten, just to sort of dovetail on all of this to kind of bring it in a different direction, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the Nevada Clean Energy Fund and how your role as a green bank is driving some of these programs as well.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I think one of the areas that I want to hone in on, maybe that relate to a lot of the different topics folks have been covering, is air conditioning, because with the temperature increases that we've seen, that really exacerbates the need for air conditioning, particularly in Southern Nevada, but also in Northern Nevada as well. And air conditioning, it's really a big deal for a variety of reasons. And it has significant implications, not just for individual energy security, but also for regional energy security. So on the individual level, you've got, low and moderate income families that are spending upwards of 20% of their income during the summer months just to turn on their air conditioning. So these folks, they might be deciding between turning on their air conditioning and, going to the grocery store to put more food on the table. So on top of that, air conditioning actually makes up a significant portion of peak demand during the summer period. So peak demand on the electricity grid. So upwards of a third of electricity demand during those summer months could be from air conditioning. And that's when, the grid is most strained, particularly when we're looking at regional water resources, including from Lake Mead and Hoover Dam, becoming at risk, paired with the increasing solar and accelerated retirement of some of these older natural gas power plants in the region. That can really create challenging events for the electricity grid. And so that's one of the reasons why the Nevada Clean Energy Fund is focused on launching programs that help individuals and businesses invest in more efficient air conditioning, particularly heat pumps. Because it can have those dual benefits of helping folks and individuals be able to, turn on their air conditioning and live in safe and comfortable conditions, but it can also help the regional grid as well. And I just want to highlight one more program that the Nevada Clean Energy Fund is working on, because it relate to the kind of the regional grid stability as well. And that's school bus electrification. So we're working with school districts across Nevada to electrify their school buses, which have huge benefits, both from a local health standpoint for our youth, which is critical. Our young children are most susceptible to the negative effects and health effects of air pollution. It also has economic benefits to these schools. Per school bus, their electric school buses save about upwards of $10,000 a year in fuel cost and maintenance cost savings, particularly, even more in the current fuel price environment. But the other value of these school buses is that, they're typically parked and not being used during periods of peak demand. So part of my engagement in this program has been with utilities who are interested in using these batteries as a reliability resource for the grid. So that's just touching on, a couple of the programs that the Nevada Clean Energy Fund is working on to help advance clean energy while also adapting to climate change and promoting energy resiliency in the region.
That's fantastic, and a great segue to my questions about the adoption of electric vehicles in the region. So Chris or Kirsten or whoever wants to take it, can you talk a little bit about the Nevada Clean Cars Initiative and sort of that evolution and how that's impacting operations?
Kirsten, you want to lead off and then I'll.
Please go ahead. I was just reading Dr. Wall's comment. A great point that air conditioning is also critical in in the wake of the wildfire smoke. And we're seeing an increased need for air conditioning for that reason as well.
You know, I'll add on that point too, before we segue to the next component there, question. You know, we're very intently looking at HVAC systems here in Nevada, as you probably have heard, with our water constraints. And, you know, somewhere of upwards of about 48% of water usage could be used for cooling in a facility. And what that means for us from an economic development standpoint is that we have to be hypersensitive to the type of industry that's coming into the state and their water usage. And we are partnering with SNWA. We are now incorporating their review and into the analysis into our decision-making matrix around the types of companies coming in. You know, an example would be, and this is a real example, you know, having a bottling manufacturing facility come into Southern Nevada that's going to ship bottled water to California doesn't make much sense. Those things do pop up. But beyond that, and I think that the important piece of this is that we've got to make sure that we integrate the experts in these areas into our decision-making early on. So when a regional development authority entertains an application for a company looking to come in and build whatever facility, we want to know if they're open to working with within our local ecosystem on using the newest and best technology, even though it may cost more. We have a low tax environment. You know, you guys know there's no corporate income tax, no state, no personal income tax here, but there's going to be trade-offs. You know, it's a low tax environment, but we need companies to maybe spend a little bit more on the technology that they're adopting to mitigate some of their water usage. These are policy issues we're seeking to spur a discussion on right now. We haven't arrived at any final decisions, but we've got to make decisions because we're quickly getting to a position where we're going to have to make trade-offs. And the more that we can have those discussions and get stakeholders engaged to weigh, you know, what those trade-offs will look like, the better off we'll all be. Sorry, with respect to the electrification or EVs, from our standpoint in economic development, we want to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support the adoption of electric vehicles. It's interesting because we're a rural state, and there's a number of initiatives coming out of the federal government where there's requirements on you know the mileage in between charging stations, but because we're rural, we have some hurdles we have to overcome. And that is that do we have the infrastructure that will support the charging stations? The other thing that's just practical, but you know, driving from Las Vegas to Carson City is a long drive, and you know, when a charging station goes down, how do you get service out there? And service could take 24 hours. Well, that doesn't work if you've got cars that are actually en route that need to be somewhere, right? So, you know, we've got, one is making sure that we map out and build the infrastructure and encourage private investment in getting that infrastructure built to spur the adoption of the technology. But after it's built, what does that look like? And so we've got to approach this from, I think, a multiple lenses here. And there, you know, any new technology like this and adoption there's going to be challenges that pop up. And I think we just need to make sure that we're anticipating as best we can. The last thing I'll say is that we've had a Clark County lands bill that has been going through the Senate. I don't know that makes it through this session. But when we think about large developments, potential for those, and the water equation here changes this dynamic significantly. But these types of industrial developments going in, we ought to lean towards the adoption of these technologies and encouraging our local government in their zoning and how we approach the strategy around those developments. So when new industries coming in to greenfield development, we ought to have requirements in place for these stations. And we need to be, like I say, forward leaning in this area and getting the technology adopted. So I think I'll leave it there.
Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
Let me foot stomp that I am speaking as a private citizen. I have no authority to speak on behalf of DOD or the Air Force or Nellis. However, I spend an awful lot of time as a consultant connecting major players in the renewable energy industry to offices in the Pentagon. And the office's Director of Energy Programs, working for the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Energy Installations and Environment, has very openly in a number of public fora stated that the Air Force sees the next big thing for clean energy entrepreneurs to create charging networks on bases. And they don't want to own the infrastructure. You know, the Congresswoman will tell you how difficult it is to get new things appropriated. But the Air Force recognizes that not only are many of their non-tactical vehicles shifting over towards electric, but lots and lots of men and women who work on the base all over the country are going to have electric vehicles and need a charging station. So for anybody who's out there with an entrepreneurial spirit, the ability to go to the Air Force and pitch ideas of, let us build you a charging network on Nellis, and then Chris, how that might pan into you guys' plans for the whole state. If you have customers like Nellis or Creech or Fallon that are plugging in, opens all kinds of possibilities. So, and I am a consultant. Anybody wants to pay me to help, just give me a holler.
Congresswoman Titus, yeah, I was going to pitch it to you next.
Well, I just want to remind you all of the funding that was in the infrastructure bill for this transition to electric cars. I mean, the administration's already sent $5.5 million to Nevada to expand the EV charging infrastructure, and that will play into the administration's goal of having 50% electric cars by 2030. It'll save Nevadans over $14 billion in gas by 2050, and it'll reduce carbon emissions because we know that transportation causes the most pollution. Also, we've done this with public transportation. Just a little while ago, back on May the 1st, I was with RTC when they announced that they got $2 million in funding to start 2 electric buses as part of their system, and they want to move to 100% of the fleet by 2035, and those 2 buses alone save 60 megatons of reduced carbon dioxide. So a lot is already going on, and as we talk about I-11 to Phoenix, the notion is you build those stations as you go, then you don't have to go back and put them in like was mentioned from here to Reno. I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in that lands bill. I have the House version of it, and I've always said it was just a placeholder and an opening start. In the Senate, you've gotten a lot of blowback from Manchin, and also you've got some wind folks and some solar people who are concerned about where those boundaries are and where they bump up against the proposed Viquame National Monument. So let's focus on the money we've got and not forget about that and see where that's being put and how that's helpful. Also, you mentioned one of the things I want to talk about is the impact on hospitality. There's a great opportunity to partner with the big hotels on the Strip for them to have charging stations. You're already seeing some pop up. I think there's one out at Lazy Dogs right on I-15 going south to California, where you can have lunch and charge. So I think we need to look at those public-private partnerships as well.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. What else do you think are the most important steps to take going forward to make sure that we're making progress?
Well, I was going to kind of talk generally about some of the things that have happened in Congress. A lot of it
Please.
in that infrastructure bill. If I can go back over some of that, it kind of
Absolutely
all together what y'all have been doing. I serve as the chair of the FEMA Subcommittee of Infrastructure and Transportation. So it's like one disaster after another, whether it's drought or it's wildfires or it's tornadoes. FEMA has to deal with it, and we need to make FEMA more flexible and be able to build back so that we are more resilient. There's a lot of mitigation going on. We don't want to just go back to status quo ante. We want to improve the situation after a disaster occurs so it doesn't occur again. This certainly is tied to how we plan, how we build, as how we coordinate efforts after a disaster so that we can deal with some of these climate change problems. And as Colonel Belote said, there's a lot going on military bases too, because we see climate change affecting national security. If you look at some of the rising sea levels, a lot of the bases around the country are on the coast, and they're going to be negatively affected by those rising sea levels pretty soon. And don't forget the Air Force Base, and I know you know this, but in the Arctic, look what's happening in the Arctic with climate change that's going to affect that Air Force. There's money in the infrastructure bill also to deal with some of the water issues. There's money for a conservation and recycling project between Nevada and California that I think will be helpful. There's money to try to mitigate for forest fires that was put in there. Catherine Cortez Masto had a lot to do with that. And so we got that in the bill. We need to study that bill, be sure that money goes out where it's needed so we can address some of these things. One of the things I think that's really interesting, some that DRI does, and I think they do wonderful work. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Subcommittee on Asia, and have been working with the Mongolians. And I know that DRI has been involved with a water project and seed clouding in Mongolia, because they want, what's the name of that storm that comes in every year in Mongolia? Do you know, are you a part of that project, Doctor? Well, anyway, there's seed clouding so they can better predict the weather, so they'll know when to bring the sheep down from the mountains that they use to make cashmere. And it's women in little mini factories who make that cashmere. So you see how this is all so cyclical. We've got DRI, Mongolia's got not enough rain. They got the sheep, they got the cashmere. That plays into women having resources, and then cashmere becomes an export that feeds their economy. So anybody who wants to pick one little piece of this will be missing the big picture where it all kind of comes together. So I appreciate y'all putting together these kind of panels, because it helps to illustrate just that point.
Thank you. I do have a question, since we have you here, sort of disaster response related. I think one of the challenges facing FEMA, if I may, is the perpetual state of crisis and emergency, right? So you used to have a hurricane season, and now you basically have a hurricane year with a month or two off. And I think one of the challenges that are facing communities and regions is that they're still responding to the last emergency, the last wildfire, the last drought, or a perpetual state of emergency, like a drought or a prolonged heat incident. So how do you recommend moving forward? Does FEMA need to rethink its approach? Do we need to plan differently altogether if this is now a perpetual state?
We do, and that involves coordination both horizontally and vertically. You know, FEMA's response to a disaster comes after the local government and the state government appeal to FEMA. And then when they give the money back, it goes through the state and goes through the local government. By the time it gets to the person whose house is washed away, they're living in a trailer somewhere and can't get their money. So there's an awful lot of red tape, and this decentralization makes it very difficult. Across the horizontally, there's so many different agencies that are involved with disasters. You got housing, who has to do something, and you got FEMA, who has to do something. Sometimes you've got commerce, which includes energy programs. They get engaged. So we need a much better coordination. And something else, and there's a bill to do this, is that many of the people who work on these disasters, take Katrina, for example, are volunteers, more or less. They come and work a disaster, and then they go back home. That core of workers is becoming less and less, or fewer and fewer, because they can't leave their jobs to go work these disasters. So we're trying to get a provision to apply to FEMA folks that is the same as the National Guard. So if you go and work a disaster, you don't lose your job at home. You have a job to come back to. And that makes, I think, more people will be engaged in these programs and volunteer for them to help us get through it quicker. And we got to, you know, just because of something washes away in a wadi, then you don't come back and build more houses in that wadi. You got to look to build back better and be more resilient when you do that. And sometimes, you know, that's expensive and it's hard to get people to move sometimes.
Chris, did you have something you wanted to add on to that?
No, not directly. I appreciate that.
Okay, sorry, but the Congresswoman does touch on something interesting, which is the increasing use of National Guard forces for these kinds of responses. I know that there's a wildfire firefighter shortage, and now National Guard is being leveraged different places in different ways, either being substitute teachers or fighting wildfire. So there are also military implications for all of these things that we've got to kind of plan for. So we have a few minutes left. So I just want to give the floor to any of the panelists to talk about some of their existing programs or any hopes for the future or things that we should keep an eye on that are coming down the pike.
I had a question that I wanted to throw back out to the panelists and Congresswoman Titus, if that was okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was up in Montana last week talking with a resource economist up there who works for Headwaters Economics, and we were just kind of chatting about different things that we saw kind of coming down the pike and different capacity needs, around, bringing economics and economic assessments into, either looking at nature-based solutions, adaptation solutions to climate change, or, just kind of talking around that. And one of the issues that she brought up, her name is Chris Smith, was the consequences of energy transition on rural economies. That oftentimes in a rural economy, that is, we're going through that energy transition, there are consequences to that rural economy, either because, a sector may be that previously was an economic driver in that region may be being phased out. There may be impacts from developing new economic drivers, or new things that may have possible consequences. One I'm thinking of are critical metals, right? So, thinking about in the state of Nevada and this all-in approach, is the state itself, thinking about how we address energy transition in our rural communities, both in terms of transitioning to new economic sources, or the environmental impacts that might be associated with, for say mining for critical metals, or impacts on, culturally significant ancestral lands of some of the tribal communities in Nevada.
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, you've raised a number of complex issues in that question, but we're absolutely looking at that and working. In fact, I'd say, I've been in economic development in 10 years now in Nevada, and we have in the last several years made, I think, much better inroads in working with our tribal communities and our tribal governments than we have in the past. We've prioritized it, and making sure that we have a much more inclusive and wider group of stakeholders involved in the policy discussions. And it's very difficult. I mean, I can think of a number of communities in the rural where they're basically, but for the mine, they wouldn't exist. And there's been some instances where we may have some growth in very new and innovative agricultural technology and industry, but they would need natural gas, for instance, to scale. And so, it's difficult as you try to, where you want to be, but taking the steps in a rural community to get there, where you've only got one industry player in the town. And if that player, for whatever reason, decides to pull out, or in the case of a mine, it could be that the mine plays out, there's no industry there. And so when you look at that long term, and there's one community I'm thinking of where they've got a mine that will be operational till 2031. They've had a industrial hemp facility that's gone in. The industrial hemp facility needs infrastructure, primarily natural gas, to scale. And there's a state prison out in this area, which has been having a really difficult time getting staff. And so the question the community raises is, look, our mine got maybe a decade left. What's the state going to do with the prison given the staffing challenges? And we're already moving prisoners out of that facility. and the growth of the industrial hemp industry is slower than anticipated. And so what happens there? And you layer on top of those concerns on the economic side with the environmental concerns, and these issues become very, very complex to address. And we're having this dialogue. We don't have any solutions yet. And frankly, if the folks that you're working with that are studying this and looking at it, I'd love to get them at the table. The more that folks that are engaged in this, I think the better outcomes we'll have. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I mean, we are aware of it. We're trying to work through it, and be responsive to the needs of these communities, but also balancing where we need to go. The one thing I'll say about mining too is, from the supply chain standpoint and how we move materials in the mining industry, there's a huge opportunity here. We have millions of cargo containers traveling across Nevada roads annually, where if we could get a percentage of those on rail, it would have a huge impact on safety and carbon emissions and road maintenance. I mean, there's just a whole litany of things that we would impact. And so one of the reasons that we're bringing the mining associations together across the states is to start to look at transportation differently. And frankly, to be able to sit down and have a much more robust conversation with UP and say, look, this is not just one state, but this is multiple states coming to you with an entirely new plan on how we move materials for this industry, and building those partnerships to solve these problems, because there's a lot of steps I think that we can take that will have a large impact that I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit, but we just haven't really looked at it strategically or thoughtfully in the past, and it's time that we do so.
Can I just comment briefly? The name of that storm, by the way, is Zud. If you run across it, it's a Mongolian snowstorm. But anyway, back to the points that are going on. We need to develop, and I know DRI is doing this, some more sophisticated use of water in agriculture, like partnering with Israel for drip agriculture. The Colorado River, we get such a small amount of it because nobody anticipated how much we would need it, and you're not going to change that law of the river. I mean, that's damn near impossible. We've stolen and borrowed and banked about as much of that as we can. But look, in Arizona, they're growing cotton in the middle of the desert. You mentioned the hemp. We are growing all this alfalfa, uses a lot of water, and we don't do anything but ship it to China. There must be other products that we can grow, hemp or marijuana or whatever. We ought to look at some alternatives there. And, I have to disagree about the nature of the state. We are not a rural state. We are an urban state. All our population lives in heavily populated, dense urban areas. And so often when we talk about getting internet or getting more doctors or getting more charging stations, we only look at the need in rural Nevada. The inner cities need this too. And a big part of the administration's across government theme is to deal with more diversity, deal with more equality, more economic and environmental justice. And you've got to talk about overlaying things. That's got to be an overlay here too. So you've got to develop these same kind of things in communities that have been left behind or have been put in danger because they get shuffled off to the border where the coal plant is, or the nuclear power plant is, or where the train station or the heat pocket or the whatever it might be, that's not a very desirable environment. So you got to look at inner cities as well as rural needs as you focus this attention on making us greener and dealing with climate change.
And I'd like to toss one idea, for Chris. When you say they need natural gas, there are some really fascinating technologies like solar thermal. There are some, solar thermal storage solutions that are going to give you 24/7. And I perked up as you talked about mining. I know that lithium mining has a big chance at being very important in Nevada. And if we can have that kind of, access to the product inside the continental United States, we're certainly going to be better off not getting it from others. A number of the major players in the renewable industry are looking at green hydrogen because you don't want to make the carbon problem worse as you try to solve it. Something like 24/7 solar thermal distributed out towards mines, that might be a great thing to put in. I know a few people who are doing proof of concept pilots, and in rural distributed situations, I would encourage folks to look at solutions like that rather than natural gas, because I hope we have as short a natural gas bridge as is humanly possible.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think the reason why the Nevada Clean Energy Fund was established as a nonprofit investment mechanism is because there's a lot of economic opportunity in the clean energy transition. You know, the most cost competitive electricity resources that we can build today are solar and wind and energy efficiency. And increasingly pairing those with energy storage is becoming cost competitive so that you can get firm electricity. But the challenge is that those renewable energy resources and electric vehicles have traditionally been resources that have been enjoyed by high income folks, particularly in urban areas that have the structure. And so the idea for the Nevada Clean Energy Fund is to support those underserved communities that have historically been underserved by the clean energy sector, whether because they're in rural areas and they can't quite get to the scale or access the contractor network to access these opportunities, or because they're low income, or people of color that have been redlined, like Congresswoman Titus just referenced. So that's kind of a big focus of what the Nevada Clean Energy Fund does, is bringing that opportunity to folks who have been overlooked by traditional investment markets because they're just not as profitable, even though they are profitable markets.
One thing I'll add, I think is a good example. So with the Build Back Better Regional Challenge grant through the EDA, one of the things that that we did in the community here in partnership with LVGEA and the cities is there's a very robust diversity and inclusion plan that was developed through our Asian Chamber, Latin Chamber, and Urban Chamber. And they held a series of seminars across the entire region and put together a platform that is built with the longevity in mind. So and I think that kind of gets at some of the tenets of what the Build Back Better Regional Challenge was supposed to do, was to bring the region together and then build new mechanisms to ensure long-term that our more disadvantaged communities have opportunity to engage in the process, but doing so at a point in the policy development process or that's meaningful and have real impact in the decisions that are being made. And so that's been submitted, and I'm hopeful that the grant will be awarded. But the work that was done to feed into that grant in that space has been beneficial for us in economic development to see, as well as starting to bridge some of the gaps in the community to get resources where it's needed. One of the things we saw, and I think everybody on this call knows this, but coming out of the global financial crisis, our more disadvantaged communities did not bounce back. And so they went from the global financial crisis to not bouncing back, and then the pandemic hit. And so they got hit twice. And so we've got to do a better job of making sure that the programs that we're developing, whether it's workforce or environment, that we're starting in those communities, that we are investing in those communities, in these platforms that are seeking to drive change, and not doing that elsewhere and then coming into the community without those investments being there. So we're working to try to do that through some of the federal grant programs that the Congresswoman had mentioned that are coming online and have been online.
That's great to hear. And we are just about out of time. So I want to give the last few minutes here to Congresswoman Titus to do any final remarks.
Well, thank you. No, it's been very interesting. I think the partnerships that y'all put together are just so valuable. And like I said earlier, this is such an all-encompassing across government, but across life kind of issues. One thing I don't know, you may have mentioned before I got on, is the need for chips that go into all this technology, microchips. We invented them, we used to make them, then we kind of gave that up to China. But the Competes Act, which passed out of the House and out of the Senate, I sit on the conference committee to try to bring that together, includes considerable funding to try to get our microchips industry back up and running and to kind of feed that industry. And if we bring some of those kind of things home, it makes us less dependent on foreign countries, and we can make our own chips that will go into everything from telephones to cars to solar projects. So I think that's something that's important. And you know, again, just the emphasis on national security, and Colonel Below let's address some of this too. But you know, when you have an international situation that causes refugees, and then you create demographic changes, and you have famine, all of these things shift geopolitics. Just like now, our dependence on foreign oil, we've gotten that down considerably, but if we move away from fossil fuels to green energy, that will help us to be more independent from those kind of things. We wouldn't have the president going to Saudi Arabia to try to talk them into opening up the market more. So it's just a topic that I cannot understand why some of my colleagues continue to deny exists. So one thing that's important is getting out the information to get people to then become advocates, and then you can move the ball on a lot of these projects. So thank you for what you all do.
Absolutely, and thank you for being with us today. And thank you to all of the panelists. Nevada has some really exciting things to going on and going forward. So we look forward to following the developments. And thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.